We have increasing demand for U.S. immigration and non-immigration programs for Canadian and non-Canadian who want to move to U.S. And this is the reason for our today meeting with Stephen Lawson, a U.S. business consultant, to discuss about some programs that are available for Canadian and some of them for non-Canadians. So let's start with Stephen and ask him to introduce himself.
Hi, my name is Stephen Lawson, and I am the founder and CEO of Losorio Consulting, which specializes in U.S. immigration business consulting.
Perfect. Thank you, Stephen, for being here today with us. I'm going to start with E1 visa and ask you to explain what is E1 visa, first of all, and then who could be eligible for E1, and then we will continue more questions.
Okay, sure. So the E1 visa is a U.S. non-immigrant visa, which means it does not lead directly to U.S. citizenship. And it's called a treaty trader visa, and it requires the applicant to establish that they have ongoing trade with the United States. That could be in the form of signed contracts or deals, contracts that would require execution in the future. It doesn't have to be actual trade going on at that particular moment. Letters of intent, that sort of a thing. And to qualify for an E1 visa, you have to be a citizen of a country that has a qualifying trade treaty with the United States. Canada is one of those countries that has a qualifying trade treaty. There's a list I have on my website that you can see whether or not the country you're a citizen of has a treaty that would support an E1 visa. So if you are a citizen of that country, then you have to show trade and a few other things, and then you can get that visa.
So when we say trade, does it mean product or service or both of them?
It could be either one. It could be services, goods or services.
Okay.
So a typical E1 applicant is somebody who either, I've worked with some that do a lot of public speaking or like personal coaching or business coaching, and they have, they're being asked to go to the U.S. and speak talks or give training or those sorts of things for pay. So as long as you were leaving Canada and going to the United States physically, and you're getting paid from a U.S. source, you have to have some sort of visa. Okay, if you're staying here in Canada and you're shipping goods into the United States, you don't need a visa. It's all about where you're located and how you're getting paid. So among the things you need to show for E1 visa is that you're at least 50% of your international trade is with the United States in volume and dollar amounts. So for example, I met with somebody who was in Vancouver, and they did business in Canada, but they were starting to get hired by companies in the US and Mexico. So that particular person, would have to show that at least 50% of the trade that they have outside of Canada is with the United States.
So when we say that they have to show 50%, how US will assess this 50%? What kind of document they need to assess it?
Typically, one of the documents I ask them to get is from their accountant. And I have the accountant, I have a letter I can send the accountant where they talk about the invoices that they've had over the past 2 years, and how much dollar amount of trade there was with the U.S. and these countries outside of their home country. And I get copies of invoices from my clients and contracts from my clients. And we use that documentation to go into the application to establish they have at least 50% of their trade, international trade with the United States.
So technically what I get is that they don't need, the applicant doesn't need to have a job offer from U.S. employer. Am I right?
That's correct. They wouldn't be working for a U.S. employer. They'd be working for themselves. They would be required. They wouldn't be allowed to work for a U.S. employer under that particular visa.
Okay.
It would have to be for themselves or their own Canadian company.
Okay.
And then they could open a company in the United States too, as long as they continue that trade.
So they could open a company in U.S. or they can work without having a company in U.S., but working or offering their services to U.S.-based companies. Am I right?
That's correct. And the trade has to be between the country that they're a citizen of and the United States.
Okay.
So, for example, when I was working at the consulate, I used to work at the U.S. consulate for several years here in Toronto, and my job was to analyze applications for E1s and E2s. And during my tenure there, we had a gentleman who was a Canadian citizen living in a different country, not Canada. Okay, he was a permanent resident in this other country in Europe, and he was doing trade between that country and the United States. So he didn't qualify for E1 because since he's a Canadian citizen, he would have had been doing trade between his country of citizenship, Canada, and the United States. So his application wasn't successful. So it's really important to make sure that the trade is flowing between. So oftentimes what happens is people buy goods from, let's say, China, and they ship them directly to the United States. They're Canadians. That doesn't count. You got to bring it into Canada and then trade with the United States. Yeah.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
So actually the nature of the trade should be in Canada and US.
Right. If you're a Canadian citizen, that's correct.
If you're Canadian citizen.
Yes. Basically between whatever country you're with, you're a citizen of, and the United States.
Oh, okay. Perfect. The other question is that how long is E1 visa valid?
Well, that depends on the citizenship of the person who's applying. Most countries, it's 5 years. Is the visa. Canada was 5 years. There are some countries where it's shorter. It depends on the trade treaty between the United States and whatever country it is. But for most countries, it's 5 years. There are some that are shorter. And when you get the visa, you're allowed to go to the United States and stay for typically 2 years at a time. So there's two different things. You got a visa and you got something called an I-94. The I-94 is the document that tells you how long you can stay when you enter the United States. So typically when you go into the United States on an E1 or E2 visa, you're given 2 years, which means before 2 years, you have to leave and go back. You don't have to go back to whatever country you're from, but you have to leave the United States and then re-enter.
By leaving US and re-enter, you mean even for 1 day?
Yeah, even for 1 day.
Oh, okay, perfect. What about the procedure which takes for having the email? First of all, is there any interview for the applicant?
There is for the first one, typically when you renew it. So the visas are good for 5 years. So in Canada, you can renew them as long as the trade continues. So for the first one, there is an interview required. Typically for renewals, there's no interview required. So the way the process works for the initial visa, that's when the most amount of work needs to be done. I work with my clients to make sure that we have all of the documents that we need to show that they meet all of the elements of the visa. And then we put that application together. It's submitted by email. There's an electronic application that the applicant has to fill out, and they have to pay a $315 fee directly to the U.S. government. And then once the consulate receives the actual application, they will email the client in about 2 weeks saying that they can make an appointment for an interview. I help my clients prepare for that interview. And then they go to the interview, and that's where they find out whether or not they get the visa. So there's typically 3 things that happen at an interview. Either you get issued, or they ask for more information. It's called 221G, or you get denied. That's called 214B. And if you get denied, they give you a piece of paper and they tell you exactly why. And if we fix those things,
you can apply.
We can reapply any time.
And what about the family members? Are they allowed to travel with the applicant, and they will get also a work visa and visitor visa for the children or not?
Yes, that's actually so. Once the principal applicant gets approved, okay, then they can bring in their spouse. They just have to show that they're lawfully married, and the spouse will have an open work permit in the United States. They can also bring in children under the age of 21. They just have to show the birth certificate with both parents' names on it, or if they have full custody from a legal proceeding, where they need to show some sort of documentation that they actually have full custody of that child, or if it's the spouses or the parents, then they can do that.
And the spouse will get open work permit. I mean, the spouse of the main applicant would be allowed to work for any U.S. employer. Yeah,
that is correct. Yes. Okay. For as long as the main applicant has their visa.
Has the visa. Okay. And for the children, is education free of charge, or they have to pay?
Yeah, they would be available. They would have access to public schools. Yes.
Oh, good.
In the U.S.
Just the school, not college or university.
College universities, they would have to get a separate type of visa. There's F1 for universities and M1 for like trade schools. Yeah, exactly.
I got it. Okay.
Yeah.
And is it kind of visa which leads to permanent residency? I mean, green card?
That's a really good question, Pardo. That's one of the things that E1 doesn't provide is a direct path to U.S. citizenship. It doesn't mean that you can't become a U.S. citizen. It just means that from that visa alone, there's no direct path.
Okay.
There are other ways. That's something that I work with as well, depending on your situation. I do have a client right now that I help get an E2 visa, and a colleague of mine and I are working on getting them a green card from a different type of process.
So in fact, when they apply for E1, if they want to get a green card, somehow they need to change the pathway to have the green card. With E1, it's not possible directly to have the green card.
Yeah, right. So same thing with E2. E1 and E2, there's no direct path. But it doesn't mean, so if you qualify under a different program, then you can always apply under that different program. So there are other types of programs. There are a couple that are self-petitioning.
Yeah.
EB1 and EB2 NIW, it allows you to enter the United States based on certain criteria without having to have a job offer or a labor certification. But the E1 and E2 visa alone, you can't just, like apply directly and say, well, I'm on an E1, I want to apply for permanent residency.
Okay, perfect. And the last, I think it's going to be the last question about any criteria for the applicant education and language skills. Is there any requirement for these two?
Well, there's no specific requirement for any education. You don't have to have an advanced degree of any type. There's a lot of people that go on E1s that just have a particular skill. Sometimes it may be something like social media. We were seeing more and more applications for E1 from people, very young people even that didn't have college degrees, but they had a very particular large number of followers on various social media platforms that and then they had companies in the United States that wanted to have them go to the United States, and they would hire them for various types of things that would qualify for E1. Language skills, going to the United States, there is no official language in the United States, although English is what most official documents are in. It would be a little bit more difficult if you couldn't speak English. And if you couldn't, you could bring an interpreter with you to the interview. And, you may be someone who speaks a particular language, and you're going to the U.S. to provide service to people who speak that particular language. Like I lived in South Florida for a long time, and there are parts of in that area where there are communities where, basically nobody speaks English. Everybody speaks Spanish. So if you're a Spanish speaking person and you go into a place like that and you want to, provide services to people that don't speak English, then that certainly is, there's nothing wrong with that.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Steve.
Yeah.
That's the end of the podcast for E1 visa. If you have any question, you can be in touch with our offices, and we will have more podcasts about different kind of visa, such as E2, L1, and the other ones. You can follow us on our social platforms, social media, or just be in touch with us. We would be happy to help you.